In this video we are going to create a simple microblog using PHP connected to a MySQL backend. This would show us a bit more about PHP web application development, but not too much to overwhelm us. It should allude to redirecting. For instance, some redirecting requests happens quite a lot in web application development. We need to transfer control from one script to another and then back. Quite a lot in web application development. We'll also take a look at cleaning up strings before we actually throw them into statements that form part of SQL statements, rather, before they get to the actual database. Some best practices and the like. And overall, it should give you a better understanding of how you basically just work with input handles, output handles, and coordinate things on the side of web app development. So what you're looking at here is our simple microblog site. Very basic. The messages go in there and they're listed down here. Now the procedure that we like to take is going data first. So we're actually going to create our database first, and then we're going to create our table within the database, and then we're going to move to the scripting aspects. Now the scripting level will deal with a particular script to manage database connectivity, another script to manage the handling of posts sent in from a form, and yet another script that represents the form, as well as some other PHP bits that actually lists this all of the posts from the database. So let's head over to our PHP admin. Just log into your PHP admin and head over to the users tab. Now the reason why we're going to users to create our database is because we're going to create a database as well as a user account and tie those two together. Now this is the typical practice. We rarely ever want to create our database and use the root account ever, simply because it's a security implication there. The super user account should not be tied to any web application credentials, especially when you have to put those credentials inside of a script so that your web application can access your particular database. If that script gets compromised, then the super user credentials get compromised, and then we may put all of the databases within jeopardy within your database management system. So the typical procedure is that you create a user with limited privileges just to access one of the databases within your database management systems. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to add our user, and the name of the user is typically the name of the database, just to keep things simple. So our database is going to be called MicroBlog_DB, and the host will be local, and our password, I've saved the password here. Where is that? We'll use this password. It's good to keep things a bit complex like that. So that's our password, and I retyped the password. Alright, so we want to look for the option to create a database with the same name and grant all privileges, and then check that option and then hit go. Okay, so once that's done, our MicroBlog DB database as well as our MicroBlog DB user will be created. But the MicroBlog DB user will only be privileged to access our MicroBlog DB database, and that's the way we want it. So when you create another database, you create another user with limited access to that particular database only. Alright, so we're going to create some fields in our table, our first table. For instance, we're going to call let's say we're going to call our table posts. Okay, and the number of columns that we'll need in that table will be about 3. So the first column will be ID, and it will be our primary key. The second column will be timestamp, and it will be a varchar. Alright, you'll see why we'll use a varchar in this case. About 11 characters would do. A third column will be message, and that will be text, just to give us enough room to store as much information as possible. We save that, and we want to head back into structure and click on change for the ID and check that A_I checkbox. This allows the ID to auto increment, so the more we post, the more this will increment, preserving a unique identifier for each post. Alright, so that's it. That's our database, that's our table. So we're all set up in the back end to receive posts from our script, and now we're going to head over to our script and author our first file. Now, this goes without saying, our deployment directory, alright, our deployment directory, you can name your deployment directory Simple MicroBlog like me, or anything else that you wish. But we've created a Simple MicroBlog folder here that contains 3 scripts for our server side. Now a bit on these scripts. Like I mentioned, there will be one script that represents the form, another script that handles the form submissions, and yet another script that represents our connection to our database. Now this particular script, the dbhandler.inc.php, is what we're about to author. And what we're going to do is we're going to dabble in some PHP classes, some object orientation in PHP in this case, where we're going to create our dbhandler as a class, as a static class rather, to allow us to connect to a database and run queries on that database. Okay, so once opened in our editor, our dbhandler will begin something like this, and then we'll enter our class name. Now this looks like any other language that deals with classes, the class keyword, and then we have the name of the class. Alright, what we're going to do is we're going to mess with constants here. We're going to store all of the credentials, all of the details that are needed to connect to that database management system and select our particular database as constants. The reason why we're going to use that is because they're just going to be tied to this dbhandler class. Alright, and I find it a convenient way to just bundle everything together rather than put this in an external config file, for instance. So as you need to reuse this, you just change the values of the constants, because they don't necessarily need to change unless you author them. Alright, so we've created our constants, our host, our database, our user, and our password, the username and our password that we've set up our database under. Okay, and now we're going to create our first static function called connect. Now the connect function is, as the name suggests, designed to connect to our database management system and return a connection handle. And this is what we basically need to type. We need to use the MySQL connect. The MySQL connect allows us to, as the name suggests, connect to a particular database management system, but in this case it's particularly MySQL. Alright, so it takes 3 arguments, the first of which is the host, the second is the username, and the third is the password. And we're going to use our die. Now our die is typically used in cases if let's say MySQL connect fails to connect, we are going to stop our script dead in its tracks and report and say, database connection error. Alright, that's basically what that is. And our function will be complete unless we return our connection handle, and you'll see why we need to return that connection handle afterwards. So we'll proceed to our second function, our static function. It's called doQuery. Our doQuery static function, as the name suggests, allows us to specify a particular SQL statement, and this SQL statement will be run against the database specified under these credentials. Alright, so first of all, we're going to try to establish a connection using the connect function that we've just created. But you'll notice here that we've been throwing self here a lot. Self this, self colon self colon. Now what self represents is sort of like the this keyword, but in a static context. It represents calling its own stuff. So the DB handler would call itself, really reference its own host constant that's local to it, and in this case it's referencing its own connect static function as well. So once this is executed here, we can assume that we'll have a valid connection handle. If we don't have a valid connection handle, our if statement will not execute that particular block that's highlighted currently. Alright, so let's assume that we do have a valid connection handle. We want to proceed to select our given database, and this is what this statement does. MySQL select DB specifies that we'd like to select a particular database to query from, and you can imagine that you can switch among various databases with PHP using this MySQL select DB function if you wish, if your script has that requirement. Again, we're going to use the die just in case something goes wrong. We'd like to report on it. Alright, and then we're going to hit the statement. We're going to actually run that statement in this particular line. So we're going to use MySQL query and pass to it the SQL statement that was passed in originally through the do query function. And again, we're going to use our die just in case we need to report on any errors that may come along. Now you'll notice that MySQL, rather PHP, uses the dot operator for concatenation. Just keep that in mind, because in C-based languages we're accustomed to that plus operator, but that plus operator in PHP is used for something else, and PHP decided, okay, well, we're gonna just use the dot operator for concatenation. So some of its symbols are a bit strange because dot operators in other languages are used as a referencer. In this case, PHP uses colon, or the dash and the more than sign as a dereferencer. But we'll see that in later videos. Alright, so we're going to complete our die statement, and it's just going to report on some errors that we may encounter, some details, just so that we can debug if we need to debug. Alright, so never forget to close your connection, even if it's still a script and it will eventually return its resources. You want to explicitly close your database, your open database connection, if you're finished with it. It's always good practice to do that. And finally, we're going to return the results from this function, this static function, if we get back any results. If not, it's going to just return null. Alright, so that's our DB handler class. Alright, it's very basic. What we're really interested in is our do query static function, which we'll use later on in other cases. Alright, so now our database is set up, our table is set up, and our bridge to our database at the script level is also set up in our DB handler inc.php. Now let's move over to our index.php, where we'll author the UI as well as some other bits. Alright, so we're going to start with some PHP delimiters, but we're going to leave them empty for now. You'll see why. We've included those up there, and we're going to start some regular HTML, and shouldn't be too difficult to throw together that interface. So basically what we're looking at is some styling bits to make this field look all fancy like this, and this button to look all rounded like that, and a horizontal rule, and we don't have to necessarily worry about this just yet. We'll see. So we're going to throw some CSS in place there, just some styles there to style what you just saw, and then we are going to create our form. So our form will use the post method, and it will specify that all of the information that's being submitted from this form will be handled by post.php, which we haven't completed as yet. So we're going to create our input, and we're going to add a class to it to make it look fancy. We're going to give it a name called post, and we're going to add a placeholder. Now the placeholder allows you to basically, it shows what's on your mind in this case, but it's not actually a value, so when you start typing, the placeholder goes away. So that's what that's for. and then we hit we throw in our submit button. All right, give it a class so that it looks all rounded. All right. Okay, so we're going to stop here for the bit. We threw in another PHP delimiter here, okay, and you'll see why we'll need this. So let me just scroll back up here so you can take a look at the CSS. I'll urge you to pause the video here if you need to transcribe it. Okay, so this is the first half of the CSS, and this is the second half of the CSS. Okay, and just ensure that you copy that HTML down there as well with the CSS class values there. Once that's in place, then you shall have an interface that looks somewhat like this, minus these posts down here. Okay? Right, so once we have our interface set up, why don't we head over to post and start that. Now, like I mentioned, the post script is designed to receive the message posted, insert it into the database after cleaning it up, and then redirect back to the index.php. Alright, so we've seen this line before in our last video. What this is, it just looks inside of an array called post, which as the name suggests, contains all of the data that comes in through our post request. We're looking specifically for the piece of data with the label post on it. Now that label post is the field value, or at least the value that comes in through this field with the name post on our client side. Right? So once we throw that in place, we can imagine that the value that the user has typed into that field will be stored inside of the message. Now here is where we need to do some validation, somewhat simple validation. If trim message. Now what this means is that if we actually cleaned up the value inside of message and eliminated all of the white space characters, such as the new line character, the card return character, regular white space character, and so on, if there's still something in there, then we need to process it. If there's nothing in there, then we can forget about it. We don't want to waste our time or waste processing resources on processing something that's absolutely empty. Alright, so let's assume that we have something in there. Then we can proceed to do this. Now what this is that it's showing a bit more of PHP, and it's grabbing the Unix based timestamp and storing it in our variable called timestamp. Now we need timestamp because that's going to be inserted along with your message inside of the database table that we've created. Alright, message. Okay, now this statement here looks a little strange, but let me explain what's going on here. MySQL real escape string is a function that is provided to us by PHP, and what that function does is it takes a regular string and it escapes any characters that may be potentially hazardous or harmful or conflicting to a regular SQL statement. This to some extent thwarts SQL injection, but more so just in case the user has used an apostrophe. Apostrophes are treated differently in SQL statements. If the user has used an apostrophe inside of their message, we don't want that apostrophe crashing our application. So MySQL real escape string will escape that apostrophe before it gets into our SQL statement and before that SQL statement actually executes it on the database. So everything is all clean and legit and safe after this statement executes. Alright, so I'm going to show you this method using S Printf to combine these variables with a SQL statement. This is what I use typically, and I like it because it's a very clean way to separate your actual string from your variables using placeholders. Now this sort of resembles the printf statement in C, using these placeholders %s or %u and so on and so forth to represent integers and so on. But %s represents strings, And what this S Printf allows you to do is it allows you to insert in a sequence the values stored inside of variables into a prepared string and then return that string into a variable. And this is what you see here. They're very this approach is very useful, especially where you have or when you have quite a lot of variables to deal with. So for instance, you can put those variables in different lines and whatnot, and have very readable code at the end of the day, as opposed to having a bunch of concatenating operators or even embedded variables which may sort of blend in with the string. Alright, so I prefer this method. Alright, so next we'll need to run that query, and the query needs to be run via our doQuery static function inside of the DB handler. But Post does not know about the DB handler just yet. So like in other languages, we need to sort of import external source code to use the functions and the entities inside of that external source code. So in PHP, you can either include it, require it, require once, and so forth. There are various ways of actually importing quote unquote. Include is less strict, and it doesn't establish a dependency, but we want to establish a dependency. We want to say that if we do not find our DB handler, then this script has no purpose. Alright, and what we're going to use in that case is require. Now require says, okay, look, if I'm trying to import or include this particular resource and I cannot find it, then this script will not run. So that's what require does. And then we throw that line in. Now DB handler is the name of our class. These colons represent the dereferencing operation on our static class to access our static function doQuery. And we pass to our doQuery function the SQL statement that we've just prepared up here. Okay? So you can see that it will correspond in this case. So you can imagine that after this line executes, there's an insert statement that runs, and a record will be created or inserted inside of our table called posts in the database. Alright, so after this if statement, regardless of whether we've actually inserted something or not, we still want to redirect the user away from post.php because it's basically finished. We want to send the user back to index.php, and this is where we work with another output handle. In this case, we're directly manipulating our response message, namely the header name value pairs in our HTTP response message. Now PHP allows us to do that through the header function, and inside of the header function we can actually put a name and a value that should be placed inside of our response message as is. And this is what we have here, location : index.php. Now what this says to our response message, or rather what this says to our browser that receives our response message, is that your location, your new location, should be this. We are redirecting you to this new location. So whenever the browser receives this as a response from this particular script, it will immediately follow that instruction to redirect and find index.php on the same web server and load it. Okay, so that's basically what's happening here. Alright, so our post.php is finished, and we can now head back to our index.php and finish this up. So far what we've done here is we've created regular HTML to author our interface. But right now what we can imagine is that we need to work on this aspect of it. Now this aspect of this interface dynamically queries our database and pulls all of the posts and formats them in HTML and displays them just below our form. Alright, so we'll start working on that. Now again, since I since I mentioned that it's going to query the database, we need to use that DB handler.in.php in this index.php source as well. Alright, and you'll see it working here. So we're basically going to use the DB handler, the do query function on the DB handler rather, to just do a simple select all statement from posts. Alright, something like that. And then we're going to say, if we have some results, then we're going to process the results. Now, the results represent a result set, and the result set is a collection of rows. Each row has a certain number of fields. Alright, and we're actually going to pull the information that we need from those fields within the row. But we need to do that iteratively. We need to go through row by row by row. And typically what we use is a while loop. Alright, so you'll see that in a bit. But if we don't have any results, we want to say, no post found. Something to that effect. So let's work on that while loop. So we start the while loop and we throw some statement like this in. Now we're using MySQL fetch array, but there are other functions out there such as MySQL fetch assoc for associative array and so on. Easier ways to actually grab and process query results using PHP. This makes it very, very simple to access information, especially values from basic fields inside of a result set. And we need to pass to it the result set itself. So you can imagine that while this while loop is executing, row will contain a particular row under a particular iteration, or at a particular iteration. Now what we do with that row is coming up next. Now you'll notice that I'm throwing some delimiters in here. I'm actually closing off this delimiter here with this. The reason why I'm doing that is because I find it easier to throw PHP inside of HTML as opposed to the other way around. Since we need to inject and format in HTML, it's better to write out the HTML and just inject the PHP values as needed. And this is why we're going to close out the delimiter. So we're actually creating a block here that will take regular HTML just fine. So you'll see I'll start a div. I'll give it some style through including by way of including a class on it, and that div represents a single post block. Alright, so inside of that post block I am going to say posted on, and then I'm going to inject the value using this PHP section here. It's just echoing out the timestamp value using row, the particular row at that particular iteration. Similarly, I'm going to throw in message. Now you'll notice some connections forming here. Timestamp is the name of our field inside of our database, and the result set brings all of that forward to us. Message, like timestamp, is the same name of the field as in our database, and the result set makes it available through the row at every iteration. Alright. So what I'm doing here now is I am formatting the output. I'm basically saying, instead of a Unix timestamp, let me take you through the Unix timestamp. Let me show you what that looks like. Let me save this here and head over to the page here and refresh it, and you'll see that there's absolutely nothing there. Alright, because there's absolutely nothing in the database. Alright, our if statement may not be working. The if statement may not be working the way we expect, but we'll take care of that another time. So let's post something. Let's post hello world. Okay, so you see here everything works. However, we're seeing a set of numbers. Now this is our Unix timestamp, and we need to format that so it's readable in a sense. Okay, so we're going to head over here and we're going to use the date function in PHP to format that. And the date function takes a couple of arguments in this case, the first of which is the date format, represented by a variety of, let's say, combinations of symbols. You can find all of those other combinations of symbols on the php.net website, and it allows you to compose a particular date format that converts this cryptic string into a readable format. So if I refresh this, you'll see it turns to September 30th, 2013. Alright, so I can keep on posting and it'll keep on listing. And what you can imagine behind the scenes in slow motion is that as I type in a post, okay, and I hit post, what happens immediately after I hit post is that post.php gets sent to post, the message gets trimmed, timestamp is recorded, message gets cleaned up, then the message gets inserted with the timestamp into the database, and we get redirected back to index. So all of that happens instantaneously. When we get back to index, alright, this segment along with the HTML that we've authored before gets outputted, but this segment does what it's designed to do. It's designed to pull every post available in the database, including the one that was just submitted, and format them. Alright, and that's basically what's happening here. So I can keep on posting and it'll keep on listing forever. Alright, so that was basic database connectivity using PHP. It showed us a bit more of, or rather showed us a glimpse of using classes, static functions, and it showed us also a few best practices in handling information that comes in and needs to go into SQL statements in a safe manner. So you can imagine, for instance, if I hit post here, nothing will happen per se. Alright, no post will be thrown in. I can put an apostrophe like "what's on your mind" and it'll be fine. But I want to show you this. Let me take this line out. Let me just comment that line out. Alright, where we are escaping the string, and I'm going to put the same message, "what's on your mind." Alright, and let me post that, and it crashes. It crashes our application because of that simple apostrophe that the SQL statement will contain, that is not meant to be part of the SQL statement. Alright, so you'll see how important escaping your strings is. Okay? Alright, so that's it.